In the farming plains of Red Hollow, fire was never far away. It did not live in houses or forests the way storms lived in clouds. It lived in memory. Every summer, when the wheat turned the color of old gold and the wind rolled across the fields like an invisible tide, the villagers of Red Hollow watched the horizon with the same quiet tension. They had learned, through years of loss and rebuilding, that flames did not always arrive with warning. Sometimes they appeared as a thin ribbon of smoke in the distance. Sometimes as a single spark carried on dry air. And when they came, they did not choose their targets. They consumed whatever lay in their path. Yet as seasons passed without disaster, vigilance softened into habit, and habit faded into comfort. Only one man refused that comfort. Caleb Rowan owned the smallest farm on the eastern edge of the plains. His land was narrow, bordered by uneven fences and soil that resisted easy harvest. He was not poor by tragedy, but by inheritance. Generations of dividing fields had left him with little more than a strip of earth and a modest wooden house whose boards had weathered into a dull gray. Caleb was known less for his crops than for his silence. He spoke rarely at markets, listened more than he bargained, and measured his days by work rather than words. But there was something else about him the villagers noticed without understanding. He watched the wind. Each morning before sunrise, Caleb stepped outside and stood still for several minutes, eyes fixed on the horizon. He was not admiring the dawn. He was reading the movement of air across the tall grasses, the direction, the speed, the way dust lifted from the soil and curled back down. To others, it looked like idleness. To Caleb, it was calculation. Because wind, he knew, was fire's first ally. The idea came to him not as a grand revelation, but as a simple irritation one late afternoon. He was repairing a fence post when he noticed how easily dry straw caught a stray ember from his own lantern. The flame died quickly, but the image lingered. He looked across his field and imagined a line of fire racing through the wheat faster than a man could run. Fences would not stop it. Water would not outrun it. Distance would not slow it. Only absence could. The next morning, Caleb began digging. Not trenches, not wells, just a shallow line of bare soil cutting across his property from one boundary to the other. The strip was no wider than his boots, a narrow scar in the earth that interrupted the golden continuity of his field. By evening, it stretched halfway across his land like a sentence left unfinished. The neighbors noticed immediately, ruining your own harvest. One farmer called from the road, planting a ditch. Another joked. Caleb did not answer. He kept digging. Day after day, the line grew. He widened it slightly, clearing away dry grass, stones, and roots until a band of exposed soil cut through his crops like a deliberate boundary. The work was slow and unprofitable. Every foot of cleared earth meant less grain at harvest, less income, less security for the winter. At the marketplace, the laughter began. They say Rowan's farming dirt now. Maybe he thinks wheat grows underground. He's building a road to nowhere. Caleb listened without reacting. He purchased his tools, weighed his grain, and returned home before sunset. By lantern light, he studied the line he had carved into the soil, adjusting its curve where the wind tended to bend. He added small piles of stone at intervals, not tall enough to be walls, but dense enough to resist drifting embers. It was not a barrier. It was an interruption. Weeks passed. The golden fields around Red Hollow ripened, swaying in waves under the summer breeze. Caleb's land, however, bore a strange scar, a pale ribbon visible even from the distant hill. Children pointed at it when passing by. Merchants shook their heads. Fellow farmers pitied the lost yield. But Caleb was not trying to grow more wheat. He was trying to grow less fire. One evening, As the sun bled orange into the horizon, a traveling trader stopped near his fence. "What's the line for?" the man asked, genuinely curious. Caleb rested his shovel against the post. "For the day something runs faster than I do," he replied. The trader frowned, not understanding, then wished him luck and rode on. Summer deepened. The air grew drier. The wind sharpened. And the line in Caleb Rowan's field, mocked, misunderstood, and quietly maintained, remained exactly where he had drawn it. A simple strip of soil, a deliberate absence, a boundary no one believed would ever matter. Until the horizon, one distant afternoon, began to change color. The first smoke did not rise from Red Hollow. It appeared beyond the northern ridge, a thin gray thread climbing into the afternoon sky like a mistake someone forgot to erase. Most villagers noticed it only because the wind carried the scent before the sight, a dry, bitter smell that clung to the air and settled on the tongue. They had smelled it before in distant summers, in seasons when fires burned far enough away to become stories rather than threats. But this time the smoke did not drift. It leaned. Caleb Rowan stood at the edge of his field, watching the thread bend toward the plains. The wind had chosen a direction, and it was the one he had been measuring for months. He knelt and pressed his palm against the exposed strip of soil he had carved through his crops. The ground was warm, dry, ready to hold nothing. Nothing was the point. Across Red Hollow, conversations shifted. Farmers paused mid-harvest. Merchants lingered at doorways. The sky had not darkened, but the color of the light changed subtly, a faint amber tint that made the wheat glow too brightly, like metal under a forge. Children were called indoors. Buckets were filled and placed near wells, more out of ritual than expectation. The fire was still far. Distance breeds optimism. By evening, the smoke thickened into a low haze that blurred the ridge line. The wind strengthened, moving in long, steady breaths that flattened the tall grasses in one direction, then the other. Caleb noticed the pattern: 3 gusts from the north, 1 from the west, then a pause. He adjusted the stones along his bare soil line, widening certain curves where the air funneled between small rises in the land. A neighbor approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "You still digging that scar?" he asked, half amused, half uneasy. Caleb nodded. "Won't stop a blaze," the man said. "It isn't meant to stop it," Caleb replied, "only to slow what it carries." The man frowned, looking at the thin ribbon of exposed earth cutting through the golden field. It looked fragile, a suggestion rather than a defense. He shook his head and returned to stacking his sheaves. Night brought no flames, only wind. Doors rattled. Loose boards hummed. The village slept lightly, listening for the crackle that might never come. Caleb did not sleep. He walked the line with a lantern hooded low, checking for dry stalks that had fallen across the soil. Each stray stem was a bridge he refused to leave in place. He was not building a wall of height. He was building a wall of absence. Morning arrived with a red sun. Not the soft red of dawn through clouds, but the sharp red of light filtered through distant smoke. The ridge was no longer visible. Ash began to fall, tiny white flecks that dissolved on the skin. The wheat fields whispered as the wind combed through them, a sound like fabric tearing very slowly. The first travelers from the north brought news without needing words. Their carts were covered in soot. Their faces carried the same expression, not panic, but certainty. The fire was moving, not racing, not yet, moving with intention. The village council gathered near the well. Plans were discussed: water lines, wet cloths, clearing brush near houses. Sensible measures practiced before, rarely tested. Caleb listened from the edge of the circle, then returned to his land. He widened the strip again, turning a narrow line into a deliberate band. He added another curve where the wind bent hardest, creating angles instead of straight paths. Straight lines invite speed. Curves invite hesitation. By midday, the horizon flickered. It was not a wall of flame, not yet, but a series of brief orange blinks, like distant lightning without thunder. The wind shifted again, stronger now, carrying sparks invisible to most eyes. Caleb felt them rather than saw them. The way the air changed temperature in small pulses, the way dry leaves lifted and fell without touching the ground. He moved faster. Stone piles grew at intervals along the band of soil, low but dense. He cleared fallen straw again and again, erasing every accidental bridge the wind tried to build. Neighbors watched from their fences, uncertainty replacing humor. The scar in his field no longer looked foolish. It looked intentional. Late afternoon turned the sky copper. The first embers arrived, tiny, drifting, harmless alone. They landed on the wheat and died, landed on the soil and vanished, landed on the stones and turned to dust. Caleb observed their paths. Most followed the wind's long sweep. A few caught small eddies and spun unpredictably. He added 2 more interruptions. Not tall, not wide. Enough. As dusk approached, the sound changed. The plains, once filled with the soft hush of grain, began to carry a distant crackle, irregular, rising, then falling. The villagers gathered again, buckets in hand, eyes fixed on the north. Fear had not yet taken hold, but preparation had replaced dismissal. Caleb stood at his boundary, boots in the bare earth, listening to the wind choose again. It chose north to south, direct, unbroken, fast. He looked at the band of soil he had carved weeks earlier, mocked, questioned, measured in lost harvest rather than gained safety. It was still only earth, still only absence. Yet as the first true glow appeared beyond the ridge, spreading wider than the eye could comfortably follow, he understood that walls are not always built from what you add. Sometimes they are built from what you remove. And as the wind drew a straight line from the fire to the village, Caleb Rowan stood behind a curved one. The flames did not arrive as a single wall. They arrived as hunger. At first, it was only light, a trembling orange glow staining the northern sky long after the sun had set. Then came the sound, a dry, relentless crackling that traveled faster than footsteps and louder than thunder. The villagers of Red Hollow gathered in doorways and fields, watching the horizon burn without yet feeling the heat. Fire, from a distance, always looked slower than it was. Then the wind shifted. It did not howl. It aligned. A steady current swept across the plains, flattening the wheat in long golden waves. Sparks lifted from the distant blaze and rode the air like migrating insects, drifting higher, then falling where the land invited them. Roofs were wetted, buckets were filled, cloths were soaked and draped over windows. The rituals of defense began, familiar, necessary, and often insufficient. Caleb Rowan stood in his field with a shovel resting against his shoulder, eyes fixed on the thin band of exposed soil cutting across the crops. In the dim light, the strip looked insignificant, a pale ribbon against a sea of dry gold. But he knew its shape better than anyone knew their own fence line. He had carved its curves to interrupt the wind's straight ambitions. He had placed stones where embers would tumble and lose their heat. He was not waiting for the fire. He was waiting for the first ember. Came just before midnight. A tiny orange fleck drifted from the sky and landed in the wheat beyond his boundary. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the stalk glowed, darkened, and died. Another ember fell closer, catching briefly before the wind pulled it sideways into the bare soil. It flickered once and vanished, swallowed by absence. Across the plains, the real flames arrived. They did not roll like waves. They crawled and leapt, feeding on dry stems, racing where the wind straightened the path. The sound grew louder, a chorus of snapping fibers and collapsing stalks. Farmers shouted. Doors slammed. Horses were led toward the river. The village felt the heat before it saw the front line of fire crest the shallow rise north of the fields. Then the first tongues of flame reached Caleb's land. They moved fast through the wheat, eager and bright, racing toward the village in a straight, confident line until they met the curve. The fire hesitated. It did not stop entirely. Fire rarely does. But where it expected fuel, it found earth. Where it sought continuity, it found interruption. The band of soil broke its stride. Embers skidded across stones and cooled. Small flames tried to bridge the gap with drifting straw, only to collapse into darkness when the wind shifted them onto nothing. Caleb did not celebrate. He worked. With a shovel and a wet cloth, he smothered the few sparks that managed to cling to the edge. He moved along the curve he had drawn weeks earlier, stamping out the fire's smallest ambitions before they could grow. The stones he had placed became anchors for his rhythm: step, press, smother, move. The boundary held not because it was tall, but because it was deliberate. From the village, people watched the strange sight unfold. The fire did not sweep across Caleb's field as it had across others. It bent. It thinned. It split into smaller lines that lost their strength as they searched for fuel that wasn't there. The straight path to Red Hollow had been replaced by a question the flames could not easily answer. Within an hour, the front weakened. Wind still carried embers, but they fell onto soil that refused them. The blaze skirted the curve, turning east where the land lay unbroken, then south where green patches near the river slowed it further. What could have been a single, unstoppable run became a scattered struggle against gaps too wide to leap and curves too awkward to follow. By dawn, the sky was gray with smoke but no longer glowing. The fields north of Caleb's land lay blackened and silent. His own crops bore a scar, a pale band widened by frantic footsteps and shovel marks, but the golden stalks beyond it still stood. The village behind him remained untouched. People crossed his boundary carefully, as if stepping over something sacred. They traced the curve with their eyes, noticing the stones, the widened turns, the places where the wind had tried to straighten the line and failed. They saw what had once looked like foolishness and now resembled foresight measured in inches. No one laughed. The council arrived later, boots coated in ash, voices subdued. They spoke of plans, of future seasons, of copying the boundary across other fields. Caleb listened, nodding, saying little. He did not mention the lost harvest he had accepted weeks earlier. He did not mention the evenings spent widening a line that others had called a waste. He only looked at the soil, bare, ordinary, powerful in its refusal to burn. In the days that followed, Red Hollow changed its habits. New boundaries appeared across the plains, curved instead of straight, interrupted instead of continuous. Farmers left deliberate absences in their fields, understanding that what you remove can matter more than what you add. The memory of the night the fire bent around a poor man's land traveled farther than the flames ever had. Years later, travelers would ask why the fields around Red Hollow were marked with pale ribbons that cut through the grain like quiet signatures. The villagers would answer simply, "That's where the fire stopped," because strength does not always rise like a wall. Sometimes, it lies flat in the soil, a line no one believed in, until the wind tried to cross it.